Hello, everyone. I am Toby Smith. I'm Vice President for Policy at the Association of American Universities, and I wanted to welcome you to this session, which is focused on COVID-19 and its impact on researchers, students, and universities, and what's the meaning for the global scientific enterprise. Before we get into the discussion, I just want to recognize that I think a lot of researchers and folks in the scientific community have been worried about the impacts upon them, but it is important to remember that we've lost over 200 million or 200,000 American lives and over 1 million people internationally. And so I just think it's important to put this in context, and we're going to talk about the impacts to the research enterprise and to researchers, but often there have been a lot of people who've lost a lot here, and so I just want people to remember that, and for those who might have lost loved ones or others, our condolences go out to you. But so to the topic at hand, you're working for the universities. At AAU, we've certainly been watching closely what's happening not only at the institutional level, but to individual researchers, and that's what we're really here to focus on today. And I am not going to spend any more time. I'm going to get right to my co-moderator and introduce her and turn it over to Kate Stoll. Kate?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate Stoll, Senior Policy Advisor for the MIT Washington office. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to let the audience know that we'll have time for your questions in the second part of this session. So please enter them in the Q&A box as you've been doing today, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. And in a minute, I will also post some links to several reports and articles that our panelists have published on this topic that will provide additional detail. So I encourage you to check those all out. And now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists. Kyle Myers is assistant professor at Harvard Business School and lead author on a survey of the pandemic's impact on researchers published in Nature this summer. Kyle will talk about how the pandemic has affected the scientific workforce. Michaela Ricard is a current PhD candidate at the University of Virginia and co-founder of the National Science Policy Network, an innovative network of early career researchers interested in science policy, communication, and more. And Michaela will talk about the danger of losing a generation of early career scientists. Victor McCrary is Vice President for Research and Graduate Programs at the University of the District of Columbia and Vice Chair of the National Science Board. And Vic will talk about inequities in STEM and how they are being exacerbated by the pandemic. Caroline Wagner is Associate Professor in the Milton and Rosalind Wolf Chair in International Affairs at The Ohio State University. She will touch upon the impact of COVID-19 on international scientific collaboration and partnerships. And last but not least, Peter Schiffer is Senior Fellow at the Association of American Universities and Professor of Applied Physics at Yale. And Peter will discuss how the pandemic is affecting research universities and the broader US scientific enterprise. So we'll go through a first round of questions with our panelists. Kyle, I want to start with you. Can you briefly tell us about the survey of researchers you and your colleagues conducted this spring, and one or two of the takeaways with respect to the impacts on the scientific workforce, especially women?
For sure. Thank you very much, Kate. So to just kind of give the background, so I worked on this project with a group of colleagues here at Harvard, as well as some great friends over at Northwestern University. And what we've been doing this summer was first in the spring and then again over the past few months, we've been surveying academic researchers, so you should be thinking people that work at typically universities and would call themselves either a faculty or a PI. And we asked them about how the pandemic has been affecting them. And we sent this survey out to a lot of people in both the United States and Europe, and we're able to get responses from about 8,000 people across these in the US and across Europe. So just to give you a sense of some of the early statistics that I think are illustrative of the degree of the impact of the pandemic on researchers. We asked a lot of different questions, but some of the questions we asked were whether or not scientists had lost an important opportunity to disseminate their research, or whether they had a project that was so disrupted that it would not be able to move forward in the way that the scientists had originally planned. And we found that 50 to 60% of our respondents lost this important opportunity to send their research out into the world. We had about 20 to 30% that had a really major disruption to a large project. And we also had about 20% of our respondents report some degree of concern about job security or even expecting a lower income in the coming year. So for this first part, I'll just talk a little bit about the first survey that we had published in Nature Human Behavior that Kate mentioned earlier. In that paper, we focused on a particular metric, and that is time use. Because there's been a lot of other ongoing work looking at things like submissions to preprint servers, looking at grant application rates, but we wanted to understand how researchers are spending their time since, as I think all of us know, that's been something that's very much has changed in this past year. And so we asked researchers basically before and now into the pandemic, again, this was in spring, how you spend your time changed. And we asked them about how they spend their time teaching, how they spend their time on research, how they spend their time fundraising or submitting grants, that kind of thing, as well as all other administrative or activities involved with their work. Now, the first big takeaway is just there is a very wide degree of differences in how people have changed what they're doing given the onset of the pandemic. And this is going to be a big theme of basically everything I say today, is that it does not look like any two scientists are really experiencing the pandemic in the same way. There's a lot of scientists who are spending more time teaching, less time teaching, more time fundraising, less time fundraising. But what we did see is where there was a clear overall downward shift in scientists spending their time, it was in research. And I think that makes sense given that a lot of things like teaching and fundraising, we tend to think of as not being able to change as much. And when we looked at the scientists that saw the largest declines in their research, we saw two big groups. The first was when we looked at different disciplines. We saw that the biologists and the chemists and basically people in what you might call the bench sciences were reporting the largest declines in their research. And then people in the mathematics, statistics, econ, computer science, people like me were reporting the smallest declines. And that aligns with my own experience. And I think this is an important takeaway here is not that only biologists or chemists need help, but that we should be thinking about people who look like biologists and that they have a big team or a big laboratory and need to work on specific things in specific places. But to Kate's last point of her question, we also saw very large declines for parents of young children and female scientists. And I think this is something that other research is also showing. It's sadly wasn't something that we were surprised to find, but I think this is indicative of how do we say it? When we were talking about this result, it's that work from home does not work when you have kids at home. I think that's a lot of people can affiliate with that, and we certainly do see that in the data. And so we're still working in the second survey that I can talk about a little bit later about maybe ways of addressing that, but those groups certainly seem to be the scientists most affected thus far.
Thanks, Kyle. Now I want to turn to Michaela. And Michaela, there's been a lot of concern about the impacts the pandemic is having on the next generation of scientists, and particularly graduate students and postdocs. I'm wondering what you have been hearing from your colleagues, both in the National Science Policy Network and other graduate students that you've interacted with. As Kate said, I mean, so there is a concern we could lose the whole next generation of scientists. And I'm curious if you could reflect on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Toby. And I want to thank both Kate and Toby for the invitation to be a part of this panel. I think it's really important that we include early career voices and representation on panels and discussions like this. So I appreciate the invitation to be a part of this. I'll say it's kind of impossible to represent all of the unique experiences of graduate students and postdocs in the STEM community because they are so different. But I'll try and provide some common themes and experiences that I've heard from my peers and colleagues and personal experiences that I've had. So I see two types of challenges that graduate students and postdocs are currently facing in the STEM community. I see the challenges and structural problems in graduate education that have existed for a long time, that existed before COVID-19, and that have only been further exacerbated and made more apparent in light of COVID-19. And then certainly I see some of these unique challenges and situations that have been a direct result of COVID-19 this year. So sort of on the first of those two, one of the major challenges I think we see in graduate education is power dynamics that exist between graduate students and their PIs. Is one of the reasons that the student experience, the graduate student experience, is so different between individuals, because it is so dependent on this relationship with their PI, who has a lot of control over the work that students do, the deadlines that they operate on, and just the general environment and climate that they work in. And so I think COVID-19 has really exacerbated these power dynamics that exist in graduate education. I've seen students being pressured to go into lab or wherever they may perform their research, to perform research and experiments because there's a grant deadline or there's a report due, and they feel the pressure to get those results regardless of the health or safety concerns they might have about doing that research. This is also, I think, indicative of the lack of emphasis on high quality mentorship and teaching in graduate education. I think both faculty and graduate students are now trying to teach classes remotely, virtually right now, and they need the support and the training and the resources so that we put high emphasis on high quality mentorship and teaching. Additionally, it's been pretty well documented the pervasiveness of mental health challenges in the STEM community, both for graduate students and for faculty. 2020 has been a very difficult year for everyone, emotionally and mentally, and graduate students need access to those services and support for mental health services. And so second, I want to focus a little bit on some of the unique challenges that I think I've seen as a direct result of COVID-19. There are a long list of challenges to working from home that Kyle highlighted a few already. I think everyone in the workforce is facing these challenges of trying to work remotely and be productive, not just graduate students. But we need to be particularly mindful about graduate students' access to technology, whether that's Wi-Fi or a computer, or many students do computational research and they need access to high performance computing resources to do that research. Also, graduate students probably aren't privileged to have a home office set up at home. They may not even have a desk. They may have roommates, they may have children that they need to take care of. They may have had to move home with a parent and take care of a parent or a grandparent. So there are just a lot of challenges to working from home and the expectation of productivity from that. And also, I think those are disproportionate effects on early career professionals, on women, on communities of color, which I think Kyle highlighted and other panelists will highlight as well. But one specific challenge that I see to graduate education that I'm concerned about, and I think others in the STEM community should be concerned about, is this pipeline of early career researchers and really this risk of losing a generation of early career researchers, like Toby put it. We're not in the lab right now. We've lost a lot of these organic interactions and collaborations that happen between graduate students, that happen between labs. There aren't the skills transfer and the knowledge transfer happening between senior grad students and junior grad students and undergraduate students in the lab. Many first-year graduate students are taking classes virtually and may have not even stepped foot in the lab that they will do their research in. Furthermore, undergraduates largely aren't allowed in research labs right now. REU experiences, summer research experiences were canceled. Senior design projects or capstone projects aren't happening. We're at a serious risk of losing this knowledge transfer that happens. Undergraduates don't have access to mentors that would normally be encouraging them to pursue graduate programs at this time. So I think we're really at a risk for seeing a drop in applications and enrollment to graduate programs over the next few years and losing this knowledge and skills transfer that normally happens in this STEM community. So I think on the second question, we'll focus a little bit more on the solutions to this, but I'm sure I've taken enough time, so I'll turn it back over to Toby and Kate.
Thank you, Michaela. We really appreciate your perspective and the fact that you talked with other grad students as well to bring in a broader perspective than your own. So thank you, Michaela. So Vic, we'd like to send the next question to you. We know there are long-standing systemic inequities in science and engineering, and some of which we will focus on tomorrow in this forum, all day of tomorrow. Can you share with us how the compounding challenge of the pandemic has impacted students and researchers from groups underrepresented in STEM? In particular, how are HBCUs like UDC, where you reside, faring?
Okay. Sure, Kate. First of all, I want to thank both you and there I go. I want to thank both you and Toby and the organizers of AAAS to have me on this panel. I appreciate it, and I'm honored and humbled. For HBCUs and for MSIs in particular, the COVID-19 epidemic has just basically compounded a lot of inequities that we had lie below the surface before that time. I'll give you an example. All of the educational institutions received their HERF funding as part of the causes, the $14 billion Causes Act. A lot of that money went to students to help students who were affected by the COVID with fees and things like that. Unfortunately, those students didn't get the $1,200 check. And for many of the minority students in that sector there, they come from institutions that aren't able to help them. If you look at our nation's HBCUs, they only educate about 10% of the African-American population, about 300,000 students. But most of those are all of the students who are in need. Okay, 90% of the other students go to majority institutions, but they go to institutions that have large endowments. HBCUs lag behind majority institutions by about 70%. So in a sense, particularly for public HBCUs, to try to find money to help students has been a real challenge, and across MSIs in general. Also, excuse me, what has happened is that for many of these students, their families, these Black and brown families, have been disproportionately hit by COVID. As you know, we know in those sectors, COVID in terms of the infection rates, in some cases 30 to 40% higher than the majority population. So you have a lot of students who have to work with parents, two-parent families who, for example, have to work, have to be concerned about breadwinners. Also, these are families who are multi-generational families. So these students are very concerned about coming home and transmitting the virus to grandparents and other relatives. Also, what COVID has done is kind of also really shown us the digital divide. As you probably remember, 5, even 10 years ago, we were talking about people getting laptops and getting connectivity to the internet. And I think with the generations of smartphones that have been out there, we kind of took that for granted until the pandemic came down and a lot of the universities closed. For many of the students at HBCUs and particularly Hispanic serving institutions, we found out that many of these students didn't have computers. But moreover, a lot of these students, even if you have a computer, you have to be connected to the internet. Many of these students were getting their connectivity either at the institutions or at nearby cafes, fast food restaurants that they would go to. Many of these folks do not have an ISP at home because their parents can't afford it or they can't afford it. So even if you had a laptop or a Chromebook, you couldn't be connected. One of the issues that also has happened is, at least for the HBCUs, particularly of the 101 HBCUs, there are approximately about 22 that are research intensive. And that research, those research dollars come in, build research capacity, but they also provide opportunities for students to get a STEM-based experience. Well, as with most universities, research basically tailed off and no research was being conducted. But for those institutions, the indirect cost that they get off that research is extremely important as far as building capacity. So a lot of that was lost. And I believe, as one of the speakers said previously, the internship experience, particularly for minority students, is extremely important. As we have seen with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the work that the National Science Board has done in its past meeting looking at systemic racism in science and engineering, the important thing for minorities and women in science is developing navigational capacity. And part of that navigational capacity is expanding and developing your networks and meeting people outside of your bubble or your sphere of influence. You get to do that through internships, okay? You get to go and you meet different people. They get to see you because probably for the first of their time, they've got to meet somebody who's different. You start to build that relationship that's all around the common issue of research and the questions that you're trying to investigate. Well, because most minority students don't have the in-depth networks to the same as others, losing those intern experiences was a real loss in terms of being able to put an arrow in their quiver, particularly as they want to go on to graduate school or professional opportunities. And while the industry, as well as government and some academics, have responded with virtual internships, which I would say will probably also go in post-COVID, it's not the same as meeting people in person and understanding the culture and being around other scientists. So that has been also a setback, particularly for students of color coming in. I think one of the things that you will see, obviously on a post-COVID side, is more partnerships of minority serving institutions with majority serving institutions in order to have those pipelines of opportunity and options for both students and faculty. And that's where my last point is. Many of the faculty who are at our nation's HBCUs and other MSIs are there for the commitment. They kind of have a dual role. One is not only to teach their practice, particularly in the scientific disciplines, but also to make sure that those students are successful to go on and that we can eventually reach the idea of a multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy, and particularly in science. For many of those teachers, summer internships themselves or faculty practicums away from their home institution in order to find out what are the latest things that are going on in either government or industry labs or other university labs, and the ability to bring that back to their institution is extremely important. However, that the pandemic cut that off. And so therefore, some of that new knowledge and some of that feedback mechanism, because you want to make sure that the students are learning whatever the latest techniques are, or at least part of what is the latest narrative in their particular field, that opportunity got lost. And particularly for minority serving institutions, because many of them don't have those in-depth partnerships, or they don't have those connections to those networks. That puts their students in peril, not only academically, but professionally.
Vic, thanks. I really appreciate that you brought up partnerships. I know we are talking a lot with our AAU institutions about what types of partnerships can be formed with MSIs and HBCUs. So look forward to continuing to talk to you about that issue. I want to turn to Caroline because we want to talk a little bit about international partnerships. Caroline, international partnerships have never been easy. They've probably gotten harder in recent years. And the pandemic, of course, adds a whole new layer of complexity to that. So I want to ask you if you can speak a little bit to both perhaps the challenges that we've seen resulting from COVID-19, as well as maybe some opportunities.
I want to start off by saying, to remind everyone how much international science has changed even up until the pandemic. In the last 40 years, we've gone from having 7 countries responsible for more than 90% of all the scientific output to now having 25 countries in that 90%. One of the biggest of those to join that group of producers is China. And in fact, up until the pandemic, China had already bumped the UK off as our top partner to the United States in international collaborative research. We were already collaborating actively with China, and it had become our largest single country partner in international collaboration. 2 other facts about international collaboration to keep in mind. One is that international collaboration is where almost all the growth in science has gone on in the United States. That's where we see the most new articles coming out. And secondly, it's also the most highly cited work within the United States. It tends to be at the level of the international collaborative partnerships. Those partnerships now account for about 1/4 of all of the publications coming out of the United States. The US is actually a slightly lower international partner than other countries because of the sheer nature of our size. So what we saw, actually, we put together an international team to look at international collaboration in the earliest days of COVID. We were interested in finding out how the impact of the pandemic influenced scientific collaboration and teaming. So we put together an international team of our own. We had Caroline Frey from MIT. We had Xiaojing Shai from Zhejiang University in China. She was here as a Fulbright fellow studying with me. And then we had Yi Zhang from University of Technology, Sydney. So we put together our own little team to look at the question of collaboration in coronavirus research. What we found is that in the months leading up to the pandemic, China was already one of the primary producers of coronavirus research, in part because of their experience with SARS. In addition, the United States had a large international collaboration around coronavirus already leading up to the pandemic. So what we saw is in the very earliest days of the pandemic, and against what you heard in the news, China produced the initial most important results about the coronavirus right at the start, immediately, right off the bat. The top 6 most highly cited works at the earliest days of the pandemic came straight out of China. Then what we saw is that international collaborations were renewed, especially between the US and China, and also with the UK, United States, and China in a triplicate network connection. And what we found among those collaborations is, number one, we see, and this is something we see in international collaboration in general, is that it's based partly on reputation and relationship. So people that already had a relationship working with each other reconnected. The second reason people would get together is because of a reputation, and that is the reputation of the researcher or the research institution attracted that collaboration. And so what we saw in the earliest days is that those relationships were reinstated around February. And we saw very much the pattern we kind of expected to see, which is a reinstatement of the relationships that were already there. And in fact, the relationship between the US and China actually increased in numbers and in numbers of teaming partnerships. Again, that was against what we were hearing in the news. There was a great deal of collaboration between the US and China on the coronavirus since the very earliest days. The one downside we did find in our work is that developing countries really dropped off almost completely among the teaming activities that began in the earliest days. So that's something that we have to think about and consider going forward, is making sure that international collaboration is inclusive and that knowledge is disseminated broadly. With that, I'll pass back to the panel and look forward to any questions.
Thank you, Caroline. So Peter, we're going to head to you next. In your piece in Inside Higher Ed that you published in August, you noted that the breadth and the unevenness of the effect of COVID on the research enterprise. How is university research faring? And can you talk about the heterogeneity of the challenges posed by the pandemic to the research enterprise, especially in the context of other challenges that universities are facing?
Yeah, thank you, Kate, and thanks to the organizers, you and Toby and the AAAS, for the opportunity to talk. So university research is coming back. I mean, after being shut down for a few months, almost across the board, researchers are back in the labs. Most universities and most research programs are up and running, restricted by social distancing, but up and running. However, has been previously stated, there's a lot of heterogeneity to the impact so far, and the heterogeneity is continuing. There are disproportionate impacts, as it's already been stated, on women, especially with small children, on younger researchers, on researchers with health vulnerabilities, researchers from underrepresented groups. But there's also been heterogeneity in different fields being impacted differently. So if you happen to be working in a COVID relevant research program, you probably never stopped working. You probably never worked harder in your life. Other bench scientists maybe were kept out of the lab for a few months, and that delayed their plans. If you happen to be doing work that required field research at a distant site, or if you are a social scientist, a behavioral scientist who relies on in-person human subject studies in the community, your work was stopped for several months probably, and might be stopped even now because of all the safety precautions. This is a complex, heterogeneous impact. And the nature of research itself has been changing. The life of a researcher, even back in the research labs, with the social distancing, as Michaela said, you don't have the same training opportunities for young people. For everyone, going to seminars locally in the department used to be a time when you'd catch up with people. Now that happens over Zoom, so you don't have the 5 minutes ahead of time with cookies and tea to chat with folks and catch up on what's going on. And this hurts the possibility for serendipitous interactions and ideas to blossom that we've all become accustomed to, and it's got to impact research. At the same time, when universities are facing this complex environment, they're also facing a big budget crunch. There have been all sorts of lost revenues for universities, as well as additional costs associated with keeping people safe on campuses. So university budgets have been hit pretty hard, and the state universities especially are looking at potential hits when state budgets get tightened over the coming years because of the economic recession. And this even hits home in the research environment, because many of our core facilities, which rely on user fees, things like big microscopes and lithography tools, those depend on the user fees, and they were idled for a few months. So they've got big holes in their budgets as well. All of this pandemic-related impact is happening very heterogeneous on different people, but the research environment is also being changed administratively. There's been quite a bit of impact from the federal concern about foreign interference in research, and this has hit universities in a way that is different from anything in the last decade or two, and how research is administered because of additional precautions they're taking, additional administrative steps to respond to the federal concerns. And it's hitting individual researchers as well, especially those with international engagements. There have been some high-profile indictments in the news, and that has gotten people's attention. So this is having an effect on how people do research, again, heterogeneously. Folks with strong international connections and activities, especially personal activities internationally, are affected more than others. So it's been several months of a lot of change affecting different people in different ways, and I expect that it's going to be continuing for the months to come.
Peter, thanks for those comments. We now want to shift gears a bit and do a quick another round of questions. I do want to encourage people, if you do have questions, please submit them. And we're going to then get to those after we go through a quick round of questions that really focus on what we've learned and how to respond. So to open things up, I'm going to go back to Kyle and ask you, given the research that you've done, what policies should be implemented both and put in place both by institutions and by the federal government, given what you've identified? And your research has shown that there are some pretty significant inequities. So I'm just interested in your thoughts on that question.
Well, as an economist, I'm scared to give policy recommendations and like to talk about trade-offs. So that's probably how I'll talk about answering that question. But I think just to take a quick step back, I think as Peter talked about, there already are a lot of policies being put in place right now by institutions, universities, funding agencies. And so one of the things that we did with our second survey that we ran later this summer that we actually just finished writing up this morning was trying to see, can we get any sense that what institutions are doing right now is having any meaningful effect? And the way that we started to try to look at that was by asking scientists to forecast how their coming year or how their coming 2 years are going to look in terms of their fundraising, their publication output, and how hard it will be for them to sort of restart once the pandemic ends. And when we compared that to what we also asked the respondents was to rate how well your institution is performing amidst the pandemic, we find a very persistent positive relationship in that scientists that have better ratings of their institution's pandemic response always have more optimistic forecasts, and that they forecast smaller declines in research funding, smaller declines in publication changes. Now, I just, before this, was teaching a class where we talked a lot about causality versus correlation, and I definitely we can't say for sure that, by any means that we're identifying effects of these institutional policies, but when we control for a lot of the things that you'd want to control for, like how much have you already been disrupted or what field are you in, gender, do you have young children at home? We see this relationship between the institutional rating and the scientist forecast really persists. So while I still think there's a lot that needs to be done on looking at what policies are working and what aren't, we just wanted to get some early evidence that is, I think, at least suggestive that when institutions are implementing things that the scientists are liking, that does seem to have the possibility of translating into coming out of this pandemic in a better state. Now, in terms of the specifics of what's going on, I'll give a shout out to Koger, who has a really nice website where the policies that a lot of different institutions and funding agencies are putting into place. I think that's a great resource just to come up with ideas. But I think in general, I'm not an expert on addressing disparities in this way. This is a field that I've just recently found myself working into. So for some of these things, I would encourage people to look at work that Emily Oster from Brown is doing with respect to handling young children and parenting in schools these days, because a lot of that obviously is going to spill over into being beneficial for scientists. Claudia Golden is one of the greatest economists in the world, and she's here at Harvard and has thought a lot about how to address the gender pay gap. And I think when I was thinking about this, I was attracted to a lot of the things that she has talked about in that arena. And the big takeaway there, which seems very applicable today, is to be flexible and appreciate that the one-size-fits-all policies are probably not the way to go. I think a lot of her work emphasizes that different people have different preferences, and some people are okay with working really crazy long hours and some people aren't. And so, I mean, it'll remain to be seen whether the big disruptions that the pandemic has caused is going to provide a kind of turning point where we can more easily appreciate that not everyone needs the same amount of resources to be equally productive. But I think, encouraging that flexibility is an important step. There's been good evidence that when institutions try to be too equal, that can create unequal outcomes. So Jenna Stearns is a great economist at UC Davis, and she has a very nice paper that showed that over the past couple of decades, as institutions, did these policies where they treated male and female parents equally, that really benefited the male scientists. That helped them in their tenure competitions, but it was not as helpful for the women. And I think there's a lot of work along those lines showing the value of these differential policies for different people. And so that's kind of will be my pitch for this.
Thank you, Kyle. Michaela, I'm going to turn to you now for a solution-based question. Given the extra challenges the pandemic has posed for early career researchers, what do you think are the most effective policy solutions to prevent a massive attrition of emerging researchers?
Thanks, Kate. I think the solutions are also twofold, kind of as the problems I laid out in my first response. There are, I think, the long-term solutions that are needed to address the underlying existing challenges within graduate education, and then some of the short-term policies and solutions to address some of the short-term and direct impacts that COVID-19 is having. So for the former, for some of these challenges in graduate education that have long existed, I think there's been many discussions and panels and reports and experts talk about all of the challenges in graduate education. I'd particularly point people to the National Academy's latest report on modernizing graduate education. So I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I think some of the big challenges that need to be addressed are, one, that I mentioned, the power dynamics that exist between graduate students and PIs, and climates for harassment that creates. Emphasis on high quality mentorship and teaching. Graduate students need access to mentors outside of academia. It's less than 40% of people with a PhD in STEM actually hold tenure track faculty positions. And so graduate students are pursuing a wide range of career pathways, and we need to be equipping them with the skills and expertise to be successful in all of those career pathways. Graduate students need to be paid a living wage, and they need access to benefits like maternity and paternity leave. They need good healthcare coverage, which includes access to mental health services. So there's a lot there that needs to be addressed, but some of the specifics and short-term impacts of COVID-19, and I think some solutions we need to be thinking about there. is that funding and grant deadlines need to be flexible, they need to be extended. This isn't a time when we should be kicking graduate students and postdocs off of their funding sources and healthcare coverage in the middle of a pandemic. We need to be doing all that we can to make sure that graduate students and postdocs have access to secure and sustainable funding sources. And that funding is often not flexible to allow students to purchase equipment or technology resources they need to be able to work from home and be productive from home. Many companies are doing this for their employees to get them the resources they need for a home office setup or support for childcare or for parents trying to homeschool their children. We need to be doing the same thing for graduate students if we expect any level of productivity from them. And then we really need programs that are really specifically going to address this attrition of students from STEM, particularly at the undergraduate level. Undergrads need access to opportunities to engage in science, to engage in resource, to have access to mentors that can help them. I think Vic also highlighted the importance of internships, and that is a practical experience for people to gain experience in STEM, and there need to be paid research opportunities for undergraduates that also provide equitable access to these STEM career pathways. And so just in summary, I think we really need to put the emphasis back on education and graduate education instead of research productivity. Remember that research is being conducted by people, and ensure that we're providing the support that individuals need to get access to high quality training and mentorship and allow them to be successful in their career goals. Thanks, Kate. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Michaela. I want to turn Vic to you. You sit in an interesting position as vice chair of the National Science Board. You also, of course, are the vice president for research at UDC. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what policies really need to be put in place at this time to strengthen the research enterprise coming out of the pandemic? And then particularly given some of the obvious and things we've already highlighted, some of those inequities, not only between individuals, but when we get to institutional inequities.
All right, thank you, Toby, for that question. One thing that we are looking at, and I think it's, we see with the pandemic, and it was mentioned by one of the previous panel members, and it was something that we had in our American Institute on Physics letter report on peril and promise about the pandemic and the research ecosystem, is we saw curtailed travel, not only within the States, but obviously international travel. It has now, we kind of started the conversation about, we really need to put a lot of emphasis on a diverse domestic STEM talent. In May, the National Science Board came out with its Vision 2030 that talked about what would be the vision for research across the country, as well as with the National Science Foundation for the next decade. And one of those pillars that it sits on is this development of domestic STEM talent. I think in terms of how does that translate in terms of policy, you're going to probably see more and more bipartisan support in terms of more fellowships for students across the country, not only minority students, but students writ large to go into the STEM areas. I won't claim to be the oldest person on the panel here, but I do remember Sputnik, and I do remember the National Defense Education Authorization Act, and how millions, hundreds of millions of dollars were poured into the K through 12 educational system. We got the new math, labs were outfitted, libraries were inundated with books about STEM, and then of course with the space race on top of that. We're now at this Sputnik 2 moment. So you're going to see more policies, I think, and programs coming out of the funding agencies that are going to put an emphasis on developing this STEM talent. Also, we at the K through 12 level. I just got off a blue ribbon task force with one of the armed services, and because the armed services and their contracting base, they can only hire US citizens. And we're talking about in the research laboratories, you're going to see this more of an emphasis on developing this domestic diverse STEM talent. And so I see people both at our university, we're seeing it in funding opportunities where they want to develop this talent. And also, I should say, also at all levels. And so 2 years ago, the National Science Board did a study on the skilled technical workforce. These are people who have STEM capable skills, but do not have a bachelor's degree. And so this involves the community colleges. So that means there are now changes in policies in terms of the National Center on Science and Engineering Statistics to look at the whole STEM workforce to include these folks because they actually get a premium. And in terms of underrepresented groups, it's a great opportunity because there are multiple pathways now to get in STEM. So you can go in for a 2-year degree in engineering sciences, or even in some of the traditional CTE areas like electricians or welding, which use STEM skills because these are not the same skills as required, say, your daddy's electrician, because these people are using sophisticated equipment and they're doing coding. I think also what you're going to see in terms of policies change in terms of research is a relook at Pell Grants. In the 70s or 80s, Pell Grants used to cover somewhere upwards to about 70% of educational costs for US students. Now it's down, it's below 30%. And particularly where that hits hard is in the community colleges where we get a lot of our STEM talent. There's over 1,400 community colleges, while undergraduate enrollment due to the pandemic dropped around 2 to 3%. They took about an 8% hit. And so I think you're going to see policies coming out of both of the funding agencies that are going to encourage universities to bring in more of this diverse domestic STEM talent. I think you're going to see the hiring parts of the federal government, particularly in the Department of Defense and their contracting base, put more emphasis, and particularly put emphasis on universities that are partnering with them to make sure that they're bringing in domestic STEM talent and also nurturing that talent at the K through 12 level. So I know this will be beyond the scope of this panel, but I predict that you'll probably see more and more of a second look at investment in public education and STEM education at those levels.
All right, Caroline, we're going to turn to you now. What lessons can we take from this experience to facilitate international scientific collaboration going forward? And are there any real challenges on the horizon that we need to be grappling with?
Yeah, thanks for that question. There are a number of significant challenges that we're facing. The main one is the limitations to mobility. Right now, we're unable to travel. We know from the famous story that's been made even more famous this week with the Nobel Prize going to Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier, that they needed to meet face-to-face before they got started on their important research. They knew each other, they knew of each other's work, but it was in the face-to-face connection they were able to get moving together on CRISPR-Cas9. This I found in all of my research to be the case. 90% of international collaborations begin face-to-face or side-by-side in some way, shape, or form. Students traveling, people traveling to research locations, going to conferences, meeting at a research site. So all of these opportunities have been closed off. But that doesn't mean they're gone. I think they will come back with quite a flourish following into the post-pandemic era. However, we know that at the international level, the dynamic tends towards a reputation-based economy with a little e, that people tend to find each other based first on reputation or a friend of a friend. And so that's perfectly okay. That's how the system works. People find each other in that way. However, it's the role of public policy to come in where the dynamic will tend towards a kind of a pushing people up the scale in terms of reputation and resources. It's also the role of public policy to help come in and perhaps equalize that and increase the value of inclusion. So I think one of the challenges going forward is to look for ways to use our public resources as well as our universities to increase the opportunities for inclusion and to ensure the people from developing countries, that people that might not otherwise have been able to be included, Michaela highlighted some of those, as did Vic, that we have to find ways to perhaps give these people a little bump up so that they are able to participate actively as we come out of the pandemic, come into the post-pandemic era. Several of the things that have happened in the pandemic era are actually quite good and bode well for where we will be. And I would say those are three. One is platforms, that we have greatly increased the use of platforms to share research. So that includes things like bioarchives, archives, and other kinds of preprint servers. The second thing that we've done is greatly increase open research and the willingness of people to share data and to share their research even before it's been peer reviewed. Now, of course, we know there's dangers in that too, but the fact that openness and open access have been really greatly favored by the researchers in this pandemic era, I think that will carry forward. It's a great thing for science going forward. And the third thing is people have had to find new ways to be creative because we aren't able to be side by side. And the desire to connect, the need to share information, the need to make those kinds of connections in whatever way is kind of like what we're doing today, using this new technology, Zoom, not so new, but this conferencing technology is one way we're doing it. But I think we'll see that going forward, we'll see new sprouts coming out of our research tree.
Thanks, Caroline. I want to pick up where you left off. I also, before I do that, I'm going to ask Peter a question, but before I do that, I want to encourage people to ask questions and vote for the questions you want us to ask. We're going to have a little time here to ask some more audience questions. But Peter, picking up where Caroline just was, she started to talk about some of the positives from the pandemic. I'm curious where you see that there's an opportunity based upon what we've learned as a result of the pandemic for real changes to the research enterprise, particularly the institutions that I represent in AAU, and what types of changes, what might they make? And are there assumptions that perhaps we've thought were true that now have just been proven they don't have to exist? So appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Toby, it's a great question. You know, the changes that we've seen in access to research and access to other people at distant organizations through the conferencing technologies really have opened up a number of opportunities for people to communicate across boundaries. That is an unprecedented level of connectivity across the world for the scientific enterprise. And to the extent that universities can maintain these sorts of long distance seminars and connectivity of their local people with people from far away without incurring travel delays and travel costs, that'll be a wonderful thing. I think that we need to see some action, hopefully on the part of the government, in terms of providing clarity and openness in terms of visa and immigration restrictions in order to let international folks, students and younger scholars in particular, continue to flow to the US. And probably the universities need to make sure that we are fully appreciative of what those people contribute to the research enterprise, because it is they have a profound impact on how research gets done. And that's something that we've seen put very quickly at risk in the past several months. The final thing I would say, and this is picking up on things that other folks have said in the panel here, paying special attention to our graduate students and postdocs, the early career researchers. This has been a particularly difficult time for that group of people, and it would behoove us all to make sure that we have the appropriate mentoring and support mechanisms in place for the coming months and years, and make sure we do that. And maybe I'll add just one more, which is to pay special attention to people who have care responsibilities at home for children or for other family members. There have always been difficulties in this regard in terms of equity, and providing extra support for those people. A lot of universities have come through. We need to continue that and do it even more in order to allow people to do their very best to reach their highest potential.
Thank you, Peter. And I'll ask all of the panelists to turn on their videos now. We're going to open it up to audience questions. So we already have some great questions in here, and we'll start with that, but I want to encourage everyone to keep adding their questions and upvote your favorite questions so that we know which ones are most popular here. So I'm going to send this first question to you, Kyle. What are the best practices that you've learned during this COVID-19 period that will make you a better instructor, researcher, PI, team member, and mentor?
That's a tough, I think can you see me, Kate?
I cannot see you.
Okay, I might be experiencing some technical difficulties, but I'm going to keep talking. I think that's a hard question. I think the best thing I can do is go back to kind of what I was finishing with in my last comment, is appreciating that everyone is kind of having a different experience here, in that, you know, science is, there are lots of bottlenecks in science. We're working with large teams, working with certain equipment, trying to do certain things requires a lot of people to all work together. And, you know, any sort of, if one of the people that's a part of your team is really struggling, which is very likely in this case, like someone you know or someone that's helping you do what you do is probably going to be struggling. And I think figuring out who those people are and helping them with their difficulties, even if they're not science-related difficulties, I think would be where I would start with that.
So I'm going to pick up and ask Vic a question. One of the things that I think is clear is we talk about what's normal. Nothing's going to be normal. I mean, we talk about the new normal. And what's the new normal look like for research from your perspective once we get through this, once we get a vaccine? But I think there's a lot of things that have changed.
Well, I think what's the new normal, we're seeing it from the research point of view, is one, you're going to see this convergence of research even more often, and this whole emphasis on resiliency in research. So if you look at NSF, how they're able to respond with their COVID-19, with their rapids, okay, that was an attempt to look at that and get research real fast. I think also what you're going to see is this demarcation that was always between biomedical research and then physical sciences type research, the difference between NSF and NIH, that's going to be blurred, okay? I think you're going to see, because a lot of, for example, even if you look at the pandemic research, a lot of it involves data analytics. A lot of these things in the future are going to be using some of the industries of the future that we talk about now, 5G, quantum information sciences, biotechnology. So I think, one, you're going to see more emphasis on resiliency type research and sustainability type research. I think at the universities, I think as some of the panelists, I know Peter just spoke to this, in terms of getting the research ecosystem back up, people are going to also think about how much research can also be done online. I mean, for example, NSF runs big facilities. Some of those facilities had to kind of stop operations briefly, because of the pandemic. So there's a lot of people now looking at how can those things be automated to the degree that you can automate them, okay, and be able to collect data. So you're going to see some of those things differently in some of the universities. Also, again, getting back to this convergence, a lot of people who came and rushed in the universities, particularly in the public systems, to help out, were from unconventional places. People who were funded by the USDA, okay, people who had big, good agricultural land grant universities. Sometimes the land grant side of the house never talked to the physical sciences side of the house in a lot of universities. because there were different funding streams. I think you're going to see a lot of those silos have been broken down right now. And then finally, you brought up the whole issue about policies. I think during this pandemic, the issues of science and security have actually gotten more magnified because of that. As you probably, and you know this, Toby, better than probably anyone here, a lot of that is being made up as it goes along, but it's being pressed in other areas. NSF just set up their first Office of Science and Security to address this, and then of course, October 1, we all had to change and conform to our BioSketch templates. So I do think that research actually has a lot of opportunities coming out of the pandemic. I also do believe that there is going to probably, and this is just Victor McCrary talking, some more funding coming down the road at the federal level to look at the research infrastructure, that was hit hard by the pandemic. I think there's a lot of people who are looking at that. The students did get funding for that, but I think the research infrastructure. But I think there's going to be more research opportunities out of this, obviously in the areas of biology, biotechnology, medicine, but also looking at some of these underlying technologies like AI and quantum information systems. How could they be applied to areas like this?
Thank you, Vic. I'm going to send you the next question, Michaela, which is, what is to be done for students and early career researchers that are falling through the cracks, particularly for students who may not have the most supportive PIs, but instead depended on grad school and research communities for support, both scientifically and in terms of career development and progression? Not an easy question, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely not. I think, there are a couple issues here. But I think one, it highlights students who don't necessarily have the most supportive PIs. I think we hear that a lot in graduate education. It points a lot to the power dynamics I mentioned. And I think fundamentally changing the way that we train graduate students, and so that they really have more of a committee-led mentorship experience and multiple people that are mentoring them and supporting them, that there's not so much that's dependent on this one person over their training. But I also really wanted to highlight the importance of conferences that I think have been brought up here a few times, that in-person academic conferences aren't happening right now, and that was mentioned for their importance to facilitate collaborations, but it's also really important for early career professionals, especially for networking, to find postdoc positions on the job search and in the job market. And so they're not able to find mentors right now through those networking experiences. And so again, I really sort of harp on the importance of mentorship in graduate education, and making sure that students have access to mentors that are not just their PI, that are not just faculty in their department, that are mentors outside of academia and other departments. More and more, we're doing very interdisciplinary research, and we need committees and mentorship that reflects that interdisciplinary training as well. So those are just a couple of thoughts I would offer.
So, thanks, Michaela. I'm gonna pick up back where Vic mentioned the science and security issues. And Caroline, I want to ask you. I mean, Vic is right. I've been spending a lot of time these days responding to greater concern about China, and it came up earlier in the day. I know Marcia McNutt raised the concerns about China. I'm interested in your thoughts, because there's different opinions about how much we should collaborate with China, what the value is, especially when it comes to fundamental research versus the potential risks. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that particular issue, because as we know, the pandemic has only heightened the concerns about China, and now they're being blamed for the pandemic. So thoughts?
So this is such an important topic, and we need more than a few minutes to talk about it. So maybe we should have another panel sometime about it. It's not a trivial question, and China is not a trivial competitor. On one hand, the US system works very well when we have an external competitor. When we see some external group chomping at our heels, the US tends to get moving, which can be a good thing. And Vic mentioned that we might see additional funding as a result. That's a good thing. Secondly, we saw during the pandemic that those scientific connections, the connections among trained scientists, people who had worked together, especially people who had been trained in the United States, remained strong and were based on mutual respect and reciprocity. That's the best of what we can hope to see. However, that's not to say that the rise of China as a scientific nation is without consequence at the international relations side of things. We can look through history and see that scientific leadership is very closely tied to military hegemony. We look back throughout history, we can see that almost all the time, the scientific leader is also a military hegemonist. And we can also look and see that that may be the case with China, that there's a lot of connection between military research and the more civilian or basic research enterprise. So that's part of the reason why people are alarmed, and there's reason to be alarmed. However, on the positive side, China's research system has basically copied the United States system in almost every way, even down to the names of agencies, and really has taken on many of the values of the Western scientific model. That's to our benefit. So we actually know how their system is organized, and we can use that to our advantage to encourage the kinds of collaborations that will be to both countries' benefits.
Peter, thank you, Caroline. Peter, I want to ask you the next question, which is, can you share any information about academic job offers being rescinded because of the pandemic and financial impacts as a result of that? Yeah, can you comment on that aspect?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So any information will be anecdotal because every institution is handling things in a different way. I know that some institutions are moving ahead with some job offers. Others have instituted hiring freezes. I've not heard personally of academic faculty jobs being rescinded. On the other hand, I know that there are a number of institutions that are limiting admission to graduate programs, and I'm quite sure that there are many positions that would have been filled that are not going to be filled quite as quickly because of the financial pressures that universities are facing. Universities are very complicated financial organizations, so with many different revenue streams. And most of those revenue streams are being hit right now by the pandemic and by the larger economic slowdown. And so they're likely going to be hiring with great caution, at least for the next few months.
Well, in our last few minutes, and I do mean few minutes, we have to end very promptly. If each of our panelists could just give a 1 or 2 sentence last closing ideas, but keep it very short. So let's go in the order we've done before. So we'll start with Kyle, and then we'll go to Michaela, Vic, Caroline, and Peter, please. So Kyle, last thought, a short last thought.
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd say just one more time to appreciate the value of tailoring policies to different people, because sometimes when you, I mean, the legal side of this is outside my field for sure, but despite the trickiness of crafting policies that help some people and not others, I think is an important thing to start thinking about, because not everyone needs help. As a young white male with no small children at home and an awesome partner, I know I've been very fortunate, but I know I am by far, I'm not the typical case. And so I think help people not like me, I think is how I'll end.
Thank you, Kyle. Michaela, a last short thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen the impacts that COVID has had on graduate education, and it exacerbated problems that have long been existing. And I think, you know, that we need to focus on solutions for, and also short-term solutions. And I think, as Vic put it, this goes all the way to the K-12 level and this pipeline of science and engaging students in science, that they have opportunities for these career pathways and the important training and mentorship that they need to be successful in all of these educational programs and the career goals that they have for themselves. things.
Well said. Thank you, Michaela. Vic, a final thought.
The pandemic, we will get through it. Okay, we've been through many of these roads before as Americans, and we'll get through this one, albeit it may take till June before we get a general vaccine. But with that, there's a lot of opportunity, and particularly to speak to the young women and young men out there of all colors, that there's an opportunity. There is a call for domestic STEM talent right now. We need to call on that. We've done it before. So we need you to come out there and get into STEM. And there's so many pathways to do it, through certificates, through community college, through four-year schools, going into grad school. Because right now, what we have recognized at senior levels is if we don't have the talent, okay, particularly that diverse domestic STEM talent, we don't have the research. And if we don't have the research, we don't have the innovation.
Perfectly said. Thank you, Vic. And Caroline, please, a last short closing comment.
Sure. The international science enterprise will be revived. It will certainly show its strength and continue, and it's continuing now, and it will grow again after the pandemic. However, we do need to remember some of our basic values. 1, to openness, 2, to reciprocity, and 3, to inclusiveness. And I think those 3 values will help us moving forward in the post-pandemic era. And thanks again for organizing.
Thank you, Caroline. You're right. We should have a whole nother session just on that topic. So thanks for inspiring us to think more on this. Peter, a last final comment.
Yeah, one thing that I'll say that I said at the very beginning, American research universities have demonstrated their value yet again to the nation and the world through the pandemic. They've come up with therapeutics, they have supported their communities, they've done amazing things, and research by and large is coming back now. After having largely shut down, it is coming back. It's not at its full strength yet, but it's doing good things, and there's an opportunity, as others have said, to build on that. That being said, we need to have recognition that the research landscape has changed. Policymakers, university leaders, and scientists need to recognize that and accommodate for it. And we need to take special care for the people who have been disproportionately affected, especially those with caregiving responsibilities and those in the earliest stages of their careers, because that last group in particular, we're all counting on you to do great things in the years to come.
Toby, close it out.
So yeah, I just want to close by thanking all our panelists. I enjoyed both talking to you prior to this and then hearing what you had to say during the session. I think it was tremendously valuable. I also want to thank Kate Stoll for being my co-moderator of this session and the person who really did a lot of work to pull it all together. And a great thing about being the last person to speak is I get to say the last word. I'll leave you with the last thought that I certainly think there's, for those who care about science, let's face it, the thing that's going to get us out of this international challenge is science. We all need to know that. And it's not just the next vaccine. It's not just the biological piece of this. It's also how people behave. And I think we ought not to forget, and one of the questions I saw we didn't necessarily get a chance to answer was the role of social scientists, the role of humanists. Let's face it, this is an all of society challenge, and we need all researchers to devote time and effort to addressing it and thinking about not only how do we get out of this situation, but how do we prevent ourselves from being there the next time. So with that, I'm going to turn things back to Sudha, who is going to introduce the William Carey Lecture. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.